My oldest son sat at the head of my own dining table, passing out glossy brochures for the Oak Creek Assisted Living Facility as if he were dealing a hand of poker. I didn't cry. I took action. 48 hours later, his entire assumption about my vulnerability collapsed and he never saw it coming. I am 63 years old. I've spent 40 of those years smelling like sawdust, tongue oil, and strong black coffee. I am a carpenter. I work with my hands, shaping raw, stubborn blocks of walnut and cherry into dining tables meant to last for generations. I do not own a smartphone. My television still has a thick, heavy back to it. To the outside world, and specifically to my 3 children, I am a relic. A stubborn old ghost haunting a house that has accrued far too much equity to be left in the hands of a man who still balances a paper checkbook every Sunday morning. But that's the thing about being underestimated. It gives you an incredible amount of quiet, undisturbed space to build something bulletproof. The gathering in my dining room wasn't an intervention. It was a hostile takeover dressed up as a Sunday roast. Eric, my eldest, had orchestrated the entire thing. At 38, Eric was a mid-level financial executive who spoke entirely in soulless corporate jargon. He didn't have conversations. He executed action items and synergized assets. He was the undisputed golden child of our family, a status my late wife had accidentally cemented by praising his every mediocre achievement while expecting quiet, invisible resilience from the rest of us. Eric genuinely believed his tailored suits and leased BMW made him the smartest, most capable man in any room he entered. He was wrong, of course, but I let him believe it. For a very long time, I had let him believe it. Dad, Eric said, leaning forward and folding his manicured hands atop the solid oak table I had built with my own hands 30 years ago. We need to talk about the reality of your situation. You're isolated here. You refuse to upgrade your technology. Last week, you missed 3 group text messages about the family barbecue. I have a landline, Eric, I replied, keeping my voice steady. And a flip phone in my truck. You could have just called me. Nobody calls anymore, Dad, he sighed, shooting a knowing, tragic look at his younger sister, Sarah, who immediately nodded dutifully, staring at her plate. It's a cognitive issue. You're disengaging from reality. We've all noticed, we've noticed you slipping. You're not managing things. You're not taking care of the property. We think it's time for professional care. Professional care. That's the sanitized term they use. What he actually meant was that he wanted the power of attorney. He wanted the 4-bedroom house sitting on an acre of prime, unencumbered real estate just outside the city limits. He wanted to liquidate my life because my independent existence was financially inconvenient for his modern sensibilities. Gaslighting in a family system rarely looks like a screaming match. It doesn't look like a movie villain twirling a mustache in the shadows. It looks like your own son putting his hand over yours, looking at you with manufactured pity, and telling you that your perfectly functional mind is failing. They take a tiny, irrelevant truth, my refusal to use a smartphone, and they stretch it into a devastating, systemic lie about my fundamental competence. I looked slowly around the table. Sarah was still looking down, unwilling to meet my eyes, playing the role of the silent accomplice. Her husband was nervously checking his smartwatch. The only person in the room who looked actively furious was my 9-year-old granddaughter, Amy, Sarah's daughter. She sat at the far corner of the table, her knuckles stark white as she gripped her fork. She opened her mouth to speak, a fiery defense on the tip of her tongue, but Eric immediately cut her off with a sharp, dismissive wave of his hand. This is a conversation for the adults, Amy, Eric said coldly. If only he knew the absolute irony of that statement. For the past 2 years, while Eric confidently assumed I was rotting away in my dusty workshop, losing my mind to the fumes of wood stain, Amy, and I had been running a highly profitable, strictly confidential partnership. I made the furniture intricate, mid-century modern pieces, handcrafted puzzle boxes, custom ergonomic rocking chairs. Amy, with her battered college laptop and her deep understanding of digital algorithms, ran our Etsy store. It wasn't a cute little hobby to pass the time. It was a relentless machine. We were pulling in $12,000 a month in pure profit, quietly funneled into a limited liability company that I had set up with my estate lawyer months ago. I was entirely financially independent, generating more liquid cash in a single month than Eric did in his gray corporate cubicle. But I didn't tell him that. Not yet. I sat there in the heavy silence and let him lay out his arrogant vision for my demise. I let him talk about the luxury amenities at Oak Creek. I let him confidently explain how they would handle the house sale to fund my transition. Every word out of his mouth was another brick in the wall he was blindly building around himself. This is the part that takes a lifetime to learn, and it's the hardest lesson I ever had to swallow. We are taught from childhood that keeping the peace is a moral virtue, especially within our own families. We absorb the subtle insults, we nod at the blatant condescension, and we let the golden child dictate the narrative because the alternative, setting a hard boundary, feels too exhausting. But keeping the peace is just a polite, socially acceptable name for slow self-destruction. When you stay silent to avoid an argument, you are explicitly giving them permission to write your history. You are handing them the pen. And people like Eric? People who operate on pure ego and entitlement? They will write you as the incompetent burden every single time, without a shred of genuine guilt. They don't feel guilt, because guilt requires a conscience and the capacity to admit you did something wrong. They only understand shame, the terrifying public exposure of their own inadequacy. For years, I had compromised my own comfort to keep Eric's ego inflated. I had played the quiet, simple old man because it kept the holiday dinners manageable. I looked down at the glossy brochure, tracing the ridiculous embossed logo of the nursing home with my calloused thumb. "So the decision is already made?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Eric smiled, a thin, victorious, patronizing line across his face. "It's for the best, Dad. We'll start packing up the workshop this weekend." I simply nodded. I didn't argue, because what I was about to find inside his meticulously typed legal proposal changed everything I thought I knew about the last 5 years of my life. For 5 years, I absorbed his condescension quietly, playing the role of the slow, aging father. That ends here. The moment Eric's taillights disappeared down my gravel driveway, the emotional temperature in my chest dropped to absolute zero. I walked back into the dining room, picked up his glossy proposal, and sat down to read the fine print. I didn't feel sadness. I didn't feel betrayal. I stopped feeling entirely, and I started calculating. Eric assumed I wouldn't read the legal jargon. He thought my lack of a smartphone equated to an inability to comprehend a contract. He was gravely mistaken. I flipped to page 4, past the colorful photos of the nursing home dining hall, to the appendix. And right there, buried in dense, 12-point Times New Roman, was the real agenda. My blood ran cold. The document wasn't a standard admission form for an assisted living facility. It was a comprehensive transfer of assets. Specifically, it included a quitclaim deed transferring the title of my home, the home I had paid off entirely in 1998, into an LLC controlled solely by Eric. He wasn't trying to secure my care. He was trying to seize my estate while I was still breathing. The audacity of it was almost impressive. He wanted me to sign away my life's work under the guise of family concern. What I found inside that folder changed everything I thought I knew about the past 7 years. He had been planning this since my wife passed. Every casual question about my retirement accounts, every complaint about the upkeep of my property, it had all been a meticulous, calculated preamble to this exact moment. I picked up my landline and dialed Amy's number. She answered on the first ring. "He's stealing the house, isn't he?" she asked bluntly. "He's trying to," I replied. "Bring your laptop tomorrow after your morning classes. We have work to do." Tuesday morning arrived with a heavy downpour. Amy sat at my kitchen island, her fingers flying across the keyboard of her battered laptop. She pulled up the dashboard of our Etsy account. The numbers on the screen told a vastly different story from Eric's assumptions. Over the past 12 months, my handmade furniture marketed by Amy to high-end interior designers had generated exactly $144,000 in revenue. Every transaction was flawlessly documented. Every dollar was legally funneled into a corporate business account under an LLC where Amy and I were the sole managing partners. We had paid our quarterly taxes. Eric had absolutely no legal claim to any of it, and more importantly, he had no idea the empire even existed. But raw revenue wasn't enough to stop a corporate shark like my son. I needed absolute legal immunity. I called my estate attorney, Arthur Sterling. The appointment ran late. I sat in that waiting room for 40 minutes telling myself to stay calm, watching the second hand of the clock tick off the seconds, fighting the urge to march out and confront her. Ike immediately. When Arthur finally called me in, I laid Eric's proposal on his mahogany desk. Arthur read it in silence. I let out a short, humorless laugh. This is predatory, Robert. If you sign this, you give him total control over your medical and financial autonomy. I'm not signing it, I said. I want to counter it. I want to build an impenetrable wall. A document signed before conflict is the most basic form of self-preservation. People think a paper trail is just saving receipts, but it is actually a chronological fortress of your competence. Financial abuse within families is still abuse and it leaves evidence. Building a paper trail before you need it isn't paranoia. It is the only language the legal system understands when someone tries to rewrite your reality. The real cost of keeping it in the family is usually your own independence. Arthur and I locked down my estate. We moved the deed of the house into an irrevocable trust, explicitly naming Amy as the secondary trustee and completely cutting Eric out of the chain of command. We revoked any implied power of attorney Eric might try to claim based on my age. We secured the business accounts. By the time I walked out, I was legally untouchable. When I got home, I packed my bags. Not to leave, but to secure my life. I packed my bags with every essential financial document, family photo, and piece of sensitive mail, driving them straight to a secure safety deposit box downtown. I wasn't going to give Eric the chance to stage a cleanup of my office. For the next 4 days, I lived in perfect silence. I didn't answer Eric's patronizing texts to my flip phone. I didn't return Sarah's anxious voicemails. I went out to my workshop, turned on the old analog radio, and methodically sanded down a piece of reclaimed mahogany. The repetitive physical motion of the woodwork grounded me in reality. My mind was clearer than it had been in a decade. I wasn't just preparing for an argument with my son. I was preparing for an absolute, undeniable execution. Every stroke of the sandpaper was a reminder that I was still completely in control of my own destiny. On Friday afternoon, the landline rang. It was Eric. Dad, his voice was thick with false patience. You haven't been answering. Sarah and I are coming over on Sunday for dinner. We're going to finalize the paperwork. We've already paid the deposit at Oak Creek. It's done. Don't make this difficult. I will see you this Sunday, Eric, I said quietly, staring at the wall. I will cook. Good, he said, sounding relieved that I had finally surrendered. We're doing the right thing for you. I hung up the phone and looked out the window at the heavy oak trees lining my property. The pieces were set. The trap was fully loaded. And what happened next, I could not have scripted it myself. What I have told you so far is how they tried to break me down. What comes next is how I dismantled their illusion of control, permanently. Sunday evening arrived, carrying the scent of roasted garlic and impending conflict. I set the table exactly as I had for 3 decades. Eric arrived first, carrying a sleek briefcase that looked aggressively out of place in my rustic hallway. Sarah and her husband trailed behind him like anxious shadows. Amy was already there, sitting quietly at her usual spot, her battered laptop resting ominously on her knees beneath the tablecloth. We ate in relative silence. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with one of my chisels. As soon as the plates were cleared, Eric didn't even bother with coffee. He unlatched his briefcase with a loud, authoritative snap. All right, Dad, let's not drag this out, Eric said, sliding papers across the polished oak. The deposit at Oak Creek is non-refundable and the movers are booked. I need your signature on the power of attorney and quitclaim deed so I can list this house on Tuesday. I didn't reach for the pen. I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, crystalline clarity. I am not signing those papers, Eric, I said quietly. And you are not selling my house. Eric sighed. Dad, we talked about this. You are not capable of managing your finances anymore. Amy, I said, not taking my eyes off my son. Show him. Amy pulled her laptop onto the table. The Wi-Fi buffered for 10 agonizing seconds, an imperfect delay making the silence stretch into eternity. Then the Etsy dashboard loaded, casting a sterile glow. She turned the screen toward Eric. The numbers were massive. Total revenue, $144,000. Underneath it, Sterling and Granddaughter LLC. Eric stared. He leaned in, brow furrowing as if the numbers were alien. He blinked hard, reading the LLC name aloud, his confident voice cracking. He reached to touch the screen, hand hovering, trembling slightly. The arrogant executive was paralyzed by the realization that the helpless relic outturned him. Sarah and her husband leaned over to look, and their faces drained of color. The room went dead silent. "I don't need anyone to manage my life," I said softly. Eric's mouth opened and closed. "This is fake," he stammered, eyes darting between us. "You make wooden chairs. This is tax fraud. You're laundering money." "It is a fully registered corporate entity, Uncle Eric," Amy said, her voice dripping with the exact same condescension he usually reserved for her. "Taxes are paid quarterly. The attorney of record is Arthur Sterling. You can call him in the morning if you want to verify the trust fund." "Trust fund?" Sarah echoed, her voice squeaking. "What trust fund?" "The irrevocable trust holding the deed," I explained, leaning back. "The one bypassing probate and giving Amy sole administrative power. You see, Eric, you were so busy plotting to take my house that you never stopped to ask what I was doing in that workshop. Boundaries are simply a clear description of what you will and will not accept in your life. Enforcing them is not an act of cruelty, it is the ultimate act of clarity. You cannot reason with someone who actively benefits from misunderstanding you. People who scream the loudest about family loyalty have almost always done the least to actually earn it. They view your independence as a personal attack on their authority. When you finally stop playing the designated victim, the sudden shift in power exposes them for who they truly are." Eric's carefully constructed facade shattered into a million jagged pieces. He wasn't looking at a frail old man anymore. He was looking at a financial wall he could not climb over, dig under, or sue his way through. "You did this behind my back," Eric shouted, his face flushing a dark, ugly crimson. "I am your eldest son. I am the executor of your estate. You went to a lawyer with a teenager and locked me out of my own inheritance?" "It is not your inheritance, Eric," I said, keeping my voice steady. "It is my money. It is my home. And you only wanted it because you thought I was too weak to defend it." He stood up so fast his chair tipped backward, crashing onto the hardwood floor. He was breathing heavily, his hands balled into tight fists at his sides. I wondered if he was going to throw a punch. Instead, he grabbed his leather briefcase, the unsigned documents spilling out onto the floor. That was the last time he ever tried to raise his voice in my house. "You're crazy," Eric spat, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Both of you. You're delusional. When you actually start losing your mind, don't call me. I wash my hands of you." He stormed out of the dining room. The heavy oak front door slammed shut with enough force to rattle the windows. A moment later, his BMW engine roared to life, tires spinning angrily on the wet gravel as he fled the property. Sarah sat frozen in her chair, her eyes wide with shock. Her husband was intensely studying the grain of the wood table, pretending he was anywhere else on earth. "Are you going to eat your pie, Sarah?" I asked, breaking the silence. She shook her head slowly, stood up, and hurried out without a word, pulling her husband along by the sleeve. I sat there in the heavy silence and watched them leave my property. Amy quietly closed her laptop. The house was empty again, but it didn't feel lonely. It felt clean. It felt like I had finally taken out the trash after years of letting it pile up in the corner. But what I didn't realize in that moment of victory was that the fallout had only just begun, and it would test my resolve entirely, forcing me to confront everything again. The confrontation in my dining room was the spark, but what came after was the fire. I thought the worst was behind me, but a cornered narcissist, stripped of their narrative control, is the most dangerous version of themselves. Eric didn't just lick his wounds. He launched a full-scale smear campaign. By Monday morning, my flip phone and landline were ringing incessantly with calls from cousins, aunts, and family friends I hadn't spoken to in years. Eric had preemptively called everyone, spinning a tragic tale of how my mind was rapidly deteriorating and how Amy, my teenage granddaughter, was financially manipulating me. He painted himself as the desperate, loving son trying to save his father from elder abuse. This is where the reality of toxic family dynamics becomes truly terrifying, and it is a lesson you must understand if you are ever forced to break a cycle of abuse. Narcissistic systems use your empathy as a weapon. When someone like Eric tells a story, they don't use facts, they use emotional triggers. They play the victim so flawlessly that the surrounding family members, desperate to maintain the illusion of a happy family, will trauma bond with the abuser. We stay loyal to those who hurt us because acknowledging their cruelty means acknowledging that our entire family structure is a lie. The extended family didn't call me to hear my side of the story. They called to pressure me into compliance, to beg me to just listen to Eric because his orchestrated panic was making them uncomfortable. They wanted me to sacrifice my autonomy so they wouldn't have to deal with his tantrums. It is a profound betrayal when you realize that your family would rather you be comfortably institutionalized than deal with the uncomfortable truth of your independence. I didn't argue with them. I didn't defend myself. I simply instituted a policy of total no contact. No contact is not a dramatic punishment. It is a clinical, medical decision for your own mental health and your absolute survival. I unplugged the heavy plastic landline from the wall. I turned off the prepaid flip phone and shoved it into a drawer. I went out to my workshop, turned on the scratchy analog radio, and methodically sanded down a new walnut tabletop. I let the absolute silence do the heavy lifting. When you refuse to participate in a smear campaign, the person running it eventually runs out of material. They are left screaming into a void, and slowly, the people around them start to notice how unhinged they sound. That is exactly what happened over the next 3 months. Eric's life began to unravel, not because I attacked him, but because I removed the safety net he had secretly been relying on. Without the massive, unencumbered equity of my house, which he had fully intended to leverage to cover his own hidden lifestyle debts, his pristine image finally cracked. The leased BMW was quietly downsized to a sensible sedan. He abruptly stopped hosting his extravagant neighborhood cocktail parties. The harsh reality of his own financial mismanagement, permanently stripped of the massive inheritance he felt entitled to, hit him like a runaway freight train. Leaving quietly, legally, and permanently is the most powerful thing you can do because it forces the abuser to finally live with themselves. It took exactly 6 months for the silence to break. It was a crisp Sunday morning when I heard the distinct crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. I didn't look up from my workbench until the shadow fell across the doorway of the shop. It was Eric. He looked 10 years older. The arrogant posture was entirely gone, replaced by the slumped, heavy shoulders of a man who had finally hit the bottom of his own ego. He didn't have a glossy brochure this time. He didn't have a leather briefcase. "Dad," he said, his voice entirely stripped of the slick corporate jargon. He stood in the doorway, awkwardly shifting his weight. "I'm sorry. I was wrong. About everything." I put down my tools. I wiped my hands on my canvas apron and looked directly at my eldest son. 5 years ago, I would have rushed over to comfort him, to eagerly smooth over the awkwardness and validate his meager apology. But I was done keeping the peace at the direct expense of the absolute truth. "You weren't just wrong, Eric," I said, making sure I kept my voice steady. "You were cruel. You looked at my gray hair and decided I was a liability. You decided to erase me rather than understand me." He nodded slowly, staring at the sawdust scattered on the floor, the heavy shame finally outweighing his hollow pride. I know I did. Is there any way back from this?" I looked around my workshop, at the old tools that had diligently built my entire life, and then back to the son who had almost dismantled it. I didn't want him completely out of my life forever. I just wanted him to deeply respect my place in it. "There is one condition," I said, my tone offering absolutely no room for any negotiation. "Every Sunday you come to this house. We sit at that oak table, and we eat dinner together as a family. But I cook. And you listen." He looked up, genuine tears finally forming in his eyes, and simply said, "Okay, Dad." Society has a terrible, pervasive habit of treating aging as a terminal disease to be aggressively managed rather than a natural stage of life to be deeply respected. We quickly strip the elderly of their agency because it is fundamentally faster and vastly more efficient than sitting down and having a real conversation. But getting older doesn't mean you suddenly stop needing a purpose. It doesn't mean your mind is automatically a liability. The elderly do not inherently need to be managed, strictly scheduled, or quietly warehoused out of sight. What we desperately need, far more than anything else, is just to be heard. We need the space to prove that we are still here, still highly capable, and still wholly worthy of the rich lives we spent decades meticulously building. So what do you think? Did I go too far or not far enough? Let me know in the comments below.